Greetings, class, and welcome back to our discussion of American history. In this video, we're going to look at the presidencies of Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and part of the Woodrow Wilson presidency. So keep in mind, this all takes place during the Progressive Era. So, a couple videos back, we were talking about the Progressive Era. These three presidents are the ones who are generally considered the quote-unquote progressive presidents. So if we were to say, the progressive presidents, you should think of Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, even though McKinley is sort of at the beginning of the progressive era. All right. So Theodore Roosevelt, he's a Republican. He serves less than 2 terms. All right. So he becomes president when McKinley gets assassinated. So in the 1900 election, McKinley chooses Roosevelt as his running mate. So remember, in McKinley's first term, he had a different vice president. Remember, Roosevelt had served in the Spanish-American War, which happened during the McKinley presidency. All right, but in 1900, McKinley gets reelected, this time with Teddy Roosevelt as his vice president. So Roosevelt is elected vice president in 1900. He becomes vice president in March of 1901, and then McKinley dies September of 1901. So Roosevelt is going to basically serve almost the entirety of McKinley's second term, right? But technically he wasn't elected to the presidency for that term. Then he gets elected president in 1904. So he's going to be president from 1901 to 1909, which is ultimately 2 terms, but he's only elected to that second term. All right. Now I want to mention this too. He is the youngest president as of the time of this recording. So I'm recording the video right now in 2024. Theodore Roosevelt was the youngest president we've had to this point. Now, some people think that John F. Kennedy was the youngest president. John F. Kennedy was the youngest president elected at 45 years old. Roosevelt was 42 when he became president, though he was not elected to the office. By the time he's reelected in 1904, he's older than Kennedy would have been. So he is the youngest president to serve in the office. We're going to look at basically 3 things. We're going to look at his square deal. We're going to look at his foreign policy, which we call big stick diplomacy, and then some interventions in Latin America. All right, so we're going to start with the square deal. The square deal is definitive of the progressive era. So think about the video where we talked about the progressive era. Now imagine that this video is a continuation of that lecture. All right, so or at least, I'm sorry, not this video, but this slide here. Okay, so the square deal is essentially Roosevelt's domestic policy. All right, and sometimes you can remember this by thinking of the 3 C's. All right, because the square deal is the conservation of natural resources, the control of corporations, and consumer protections. All right, so for example, conservation of natural resources. We talked about this in the progressive era video, the national parks, national forests, national monuments. We talked about those things. All right, so a lot of that policy happened under the Roosevelt administration. We also have the U.S. Forest Service created and the conservation of certain threatened species. For example, American bison or buffalo. If you're familiar with the statue of Mount Rushmore, Roosevelt's face is on Mount Rushmore along with George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Thomas Jefferson. His contributions to conservation is usually seen as why he was put on Mount Rushmore. Control of corporations. So he earns the nickname Trust Buster. So he's going to use the Sherman Antitrust Act, which we talked about in previous videos, to go after corporations. In fact, he brings up 43 suits against corporations. And then the last one, consumer protection. We talked about this when we talked about the jungle all right, with Upton Sinclair and the jungle and the meat industry. So the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, these are things passed during the Roosevelt administration. All right, now his foreign policy has been described as big stick diplomacy. That comes from the proverb, speak softly and carry a big stick. Basically, this was foreign policy rooted in the threat of military force. So basically, you can imagine a guy walking down the road with a really big stick. You're not going to mess with that guy because he'll hit you with the stick. That's sort of the idea there. The big stick is U.S. military power. And so what the big stick diplomacy really depends on 5 key points. All right, one is to possess serious military capabilities. That's the big stick. But notice it says naval. We're not really talking about an army at this point. We're talking about a big modern navy. In a previous video, we talked about Alfred Thayer Mahan and how Mahan was an advocate of building up the Navy. He had Roosevelt's ear, right? Roosevelt listened to Mahan. And remember, Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy at one time. So a modernization of the Navy where the U.S. builds these new modern battleships happens during the Roosevelt administration. Okay, so possessing serious military or at least naval capabilities. Acting justly towards nations, that would be the speak softly part. All right, so treating other nations fairly. It says do not bluff, right? So the idea of not, lying or bluffing, right? Like if we have the not pretending to have the capability, but actually having the capabilities. Strike only when prepared to strike hard. So this is sort of in reaction to some of the previous wars where we declared war and then we didn't actually have the means to fight the war. And we kind of had to figure all that out before we went on to fight the war. All right, so strike only when preparing to strike hard, and then be willing to allow adversaries to save face in defeat. So being humble in victory and maybe coming to terms, having treaties that allow our enemies who were defeated at this point to save some dignity. All right, now if you had U.S. History Part 1, you should be familiar with the Monroe Doctrine. This goes back to President James Monroe all the way back to 1823. But it basically said that we would not allow European interference in the Americas. All right, this was a result of all of the Latin American revolutions that had happened in the 18-teens and early 1820s. So Mexico's war for independence, Argentina's war for independence, things like that. So the U.S. recognized the sovereignty of those nations and said we would not tolerate European interference in those nations. So in 1904, Roosevelt sort of revives the Monroe Doctrine and adds what we call the Roosevelt Corollary. So it's saying, yeah, we're not going to tolerate European interference in the Americas, but it also sort of adds that the Americas are our sphere of influence, and therefore we can intervene in the Western Hemisphere. We can intervene in Latin America if we think it's necessary, but we're not going to let any other Europeans do that. All right, so the Panama Canal. Remember, Alfred Thayer Mahan. Again, we're talking about Alfred Thayer Mahan. He advocated for a Panama Canal, believing it was of vital interest to the United States for us to be able to move our Navy from the Atlantic to the Pacific. All right. So there was a project by the French to build the Panama Canal. They weren't finished with it. They'd only got about 2/3 of the way there. The U.S. bought the project, but there was a problem. So the Panama during this time was ruled by Colombia. Panama was part of Colombia. There were people in Panama who wanted the Colombians out. They wanted to rule themselves. And so Roosevelt initiates an intervention, a military intervention in Panama, where basically the U.S. supports a Panamanian revolution to kick out the Colombians. And so when we do that, now Panama is becoming its own country, but it's a country that is friendly to U.S. interests. And so they're going to transfer the canal to the United States, which the United States will have for a long time. We'll talk more about what happens with all that later. Now, it does take time to finish the canal, and so it's not opened until 1914, but it is controlled by the United States for several decades. All right, so after Roosevelt's second term, all right, now keep in mind he's only elected to the second term. The first term, he's finishing McKinley's term, but after his second term, he is going to step down and endorse William Howard Taft as his successor. Okay, so that's important to understand. Roosevelt chose Taft to follow his administration, to follow his the way he was doing things, right? So Roosevelt essentially saying, hey, if you like me, vote for Taft. So Taft wins. Roosevelt was very popular. Now Taft wins, okay? So Taft is elected in 1908. He's going to be a one-term president, as we'll see what happens with that. But initially, he is considered the heir, the successor of Roosevelt, okay? One thing that's interesting to note about Taft, so he's only president for one term, but he later becomes Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He is the only, as of right now, the recording of this video, he's the only person to serve as President of the United States and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So it's pretty impressive. All right. We're basically going to look at two things, antitrust campaign and dollar diplomacy. We're not going to spend a lot of time on them because as a one-term president, he doesn't get a lot done. Typically, one-term presidents don't have a lot of political successes. All right, we'll see what happens. Okay. So the antitrust enforcement. All right. So we saw that Teddy Roosevelt had earned the name Trust Buster, and he had gone after, over 40 corporations. Well, Taft goes over 70 suits against corporations, which actually draws some criticism from Roosevelt, which is important. We'll talk more about that later. He also engages in dollar diplomacy. So this is his foreign policy, dollar diplomacy, where he says we're going to substitute dollars for bullets. All right. So remember, Roosevelt's foreign policy was basically showing how strong our military was, using military force or the threat of military force to get what we want. Taft's dollar diplomacy is going to be rooted in economic strategy. Right? Now, that doesn't mean that Taft doesn't ever use military intervention, because he does, all right? But his goal is to use economic strategy, right? So either offering nations monetary incentives or saying, hey, we're going to withdraw money from your country unless you do what we want you to do, okay? This also draws some criticism from Roosevelt, right? So Roosevelt becomes Taft's biggest critic, right? Which is sad because Roosevelt had said, if you like me, vote for Taft. Taft is the guy I choose to follow my policies. But then when Taft actually becomes president, Roosevelt becomes an outspoken critic of Taft. And so in 1912, because Roosevelt thought Taft was doing a poor job, Roosevelt decides to run for president again. The problem is Taft already has the Republican nomination. Taft is the sitting president. He's a Republican, and he's going to run for re-election as a Republican. So Roosevelt creates a third party called the Progressive Party, also known as the Bull Moose Party, where Roosevelt seemingly becomes more progressive, more to the right of Taft. So Taft is sort of the right-wing candidate, and Roosevelt's farther to the left, right? So the Progressive Party agenda is called New Nationalism. So let's look at some of the things that New Nationalism stood for, all right? Fighting against special privilege, social justice, advocating for income and inheritance taxes, 8-hour workday, abolition of child labor, workers' compensation, fewer restrictions on labor unions, and women's suffrage. All right, all of these are pretty much seen as left-wing agenda. So Roosevelt has gone from the right wing sort of to the left wing, right, with his Progressive Party. All right, now we also have the Democratic candidate. So in the election of 1912, we have Taft, the Republican, Roosevelt, the Progressive, and Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat. All right, now this means the Republican Party is divided. If Roosevelt and Taft are in opposite parties, it sort of divides the Republican Party. The conservative Republicans are going to stay with Taft. The more progressive Republicans, who are more followers of Roosevelt than the party, are going to go to the Progressive Party. This is going to divide the Republican vote, which allows the Democrats to carry the election. If you see here, Wilson wins pretty handily in the Electoral College. He only gets 42% of the popular vote. So, most of the country did not vote for Wilson, but Wilson wins the majority of the states. All right, as we see, Taft only wins a couple of states. Roosevelt wins several, a lot for a third party. But Wilson wins the election. This is, again, why some people don't like third parties. Third parties can tend to throw an election in favor of a party that's maybe not as popular, right? Wilson only gets 42% of the popular vote, which means most people, 58% of the people, didn't vote for him, but he wins a lot of the states because of that divided vote. All right, so Wilson wins. Now, this is interesting. He's the only Democrat between Grover Cleveland and Franklin Roosevelt. So from 1896 to 1932, he's the only Democrat. But he does win 2 terms. He's going to be elected in 1912 and again in 1916. Basically, there's 3 things that we're going to look at. His progressive era politics, which we're going to call the New Freedom Reforms, the Mexican Revolution, and then World War I. However, we're not going to talk about World War I in this video because it's a big topic, so we're going to talk about World War I in the next video. All right, so the New Freedom politics, all right, New Freedom Reforms. This is his progressive agenda, right? So remember, we said that Taft, Wilson, and Roosevelt were all considered progressive presidents, right? So New Freedom, okay, we got 5 parts here, all right. Tariff reform. This is, for example, the Underwood Tariff Act of 1913. This lowered tariffs for the first time since 1857. All right, so lowered tariffs. Labor reform, the Adamson Act of 1916. This established an 8-hour workday for railroad workers and also said that they got overtime if they worked more than 40 hours a week. Business reform, the Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914. This created the Federal Trade Commission, whose job it is to investigate illegal business practices. Agricultural reform, such as the Warehouse Act of 1916. This gave federal loans to farmers, basically allowed them to store grain and draw loans off the worth of that grain. And then banking reform, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. This centralized control of the monetary system. All right, Wilson's foreign policy is rooted in what we call moral diplomacy. All right, so we had Roosevelt with big stick diplomacy. We had Taft with dollar diplomacy, and now with Wilson, we have moral diplomacy. Moral diplomacy, basically, he says we're going to show countries that, there's a right way to do things, and, we're going to teach them to elect moral, ethical leadership. So this is supposed to be a departure from his predecessors. However, he still ended up using military interventions in several Latin American countries. We also have the Mexican Revolution. Okay, the Mexican Revolution obviously is Mexican history. It's not necessarily American history. But as part of this moral diplomacy, Wilson tried to influence Mexico's election. See, during the Mexican Revolution, there were several small revolutions contained inside of that, and lots of political assassinations. So they go through several leadership, several presidencies in a very short period of time. And there was obviously a president that Wilson endorsed, and there was a revolution against that. And so Wilson sent troops to Veracruz, which led to retaliatory raids in the United States. So Francisco Pancho Villa, he's a Mexican revolutionary. A lot of Americans consider him to be an outlaw, but he actually raids into New Mexico. And so in retaliation for that raid, Wilson's going to order a U.S. Army expedition into Mexico for the purpose of capturing Pancho Villa. This is going to be led by General John Pershing, who we'll learn more about later. But the expedition to capture Pancho Villa is unsuccessful. Pershing's forces do break up some of Pancho Villa's gang, but ultimately they never find Pancho Villa, and eventually they are going to be withdrawn from Mexico because there's a bigger problem at hand, which is World War II. All right, last thing we'll talk about, two important amendments added to the Constitution during the Wilson administration. All right, they are the 16th Amendment and 17th Amendment, both ratified in 1913. So the 16th Amendment basically creates the justification for income tax. All right, so federal income tax created by the 16th Amendment. The 17th Amendment is pretty important. It changes how we choose our senators. All right, we now in the United States elect our senators through direct election. All right, so we vote for House of Representatives, we vote for senators, we vote for president. Right? In the Constitution, senators were actually chosen by the state legislature. All right, so there was not a direct election for senators. U.S. citizens did not vote for their senators prior to the 17th Amendment, but now we do. We vote for senators. All right, so there's that. I hope you learned something about the Wilson presidency. Now, we're going to learn about probably the most important thing associated with the Wilson presidency in the next couple of videos, which will be about World War I. All right, so stay tuned for those, and thank you for watching.